Welcome, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, to Phocuswright's The Long-Term Outlook on Short-Term Rentals, How to Thrive in a Shifting Market. I'm Madeline List. I'm a senior research analyst here at Phocuswright. I've had a lot of concentration within my work on short-term rentals, and I'm so excited to be doing this session with an all-star lineup that we have here that's truly multidisciplinary. We have Carl Shepard, who is famed for founding HomeAway, now part of Vrbo Expedia. Derek Barker, who's co-founder and CEO of Nectar, who will be one of our financial gurus for the day, looking at that short-term rental space. And we're actually bringing in something new for us today, which is a real estate guru as well, Brandon Lewowski, who leads the research team at a company called House Canary, which does AI home valuations. They are sitting on mountains of residential real estate data, and we know those spaces are truly interconnected. We're so excited to get that expertise in today. Now, I know that when a lot of people see, at least these days now in 2024, when they see webinars, when they see content about short-term rentals, one of the big questions that is always going to come to mind is, are they talking about the Airbnb bust? Are they talking about some kind of collapse? I'm going to start this conversation before anything with a spoiler alert that we are not predicting an Airbnb bust. In our Phocuswright sizing that we've done with a data partnership with AirDNA, we project that in 2024, we'll see $75 billion in bookings in North America, that globally short-term rental bookings will top 200 billion in 2024. Our consumer travel report has found that the incidence among leisure travels of short-term rental use is about 1 in 4 people in their past 12 months of travel. And on top of that, Airbnb has really reported some stellar earnings. So for us, that's really not indicative of an industry that's on the verge of collapse. However, there have been many changes that have been happening within this space, and it does affect who is able to really make money and who is able to profit within this space moving forward. And so market shifts are very much something that we have our eyes on, that we're concerned about moving forward. And that's really what we want to talk about today, especially shining a spotlight on certain topics that we feel don't get enough love in this space, that are under discussed, that we really want to bring into the spotlight today. So without further ado, I want to start with kicking off some questions about a topic that is very important to the short-term rental space and that became more and more an area of focus as more people were staying in the pandemic. That is the low barriers to entry that we have for the space, and that has a lot of effects on the general, both of the guest experience, the inventory, the overall PR for the industry. I wanted to punt this first question over to Carl because he's our veteran here. He's an original gangster of that short-term rental space, if you'll say. But Carl, when we've had a lot of new entrants coming in, a lot of new hosts or operators entering this market, what would you say are the green flags that someone really has ability to succeed within the space? What are your red flags with hosts, and what does that look like for you now?
Well, the ease of getting into the space is not a change from the last 25 years. If you've had a spare house, you've had time, you've been able to get into the space. I think the thing that has changed is the idea of actually people renting properties and long-term leases, and then arbitraging those properties. That brought a lot of people into the space. And that really lowered the bar for entering, because in the past you had to buy the house, and now you don't have to buy the house. So that's going to open up a lot more people who think that they can somehow arbitrage that. What are the red flags of people who are going to be successful? I think people can only be successful in the short-term rental industry when they figure out that they really are in the hospitality business, and that things that people expect in hospitality settings are going to be required in their house. You can't put, like in the early days of Airbnb, you couldn't just go in and put blue tape around your food in the refrigerator and say, don't eat this. You can no longer do those sorts of things. And you have to really be set up. So the cost of sitting up is pretty high. The other barrier to entry that is getting hurdled, people are getting over now, is that it used to be charming to stay in somebody's house, but now people have this sort of HGTV view of what properties look like. And so the investment required to be an HGTV quality unit is pretty high. So I think that if you're just getting into this thinking you're going to just rent your grandmother's back house, what now that she's deceased, you've got a lot of learning to do, and that you're probably not going to be as successful as if you say, what do people want? Where do they want to stay? And how am I going to create that environment that merits the nightly rate I'm charging?
There certainly are resources out there that position entering the short-term rental market as a real estate investment, or God forbid the term passive income is used. I think many people have now realized that it's not passive, but it is interesting to me that it's not a universal kind of identity when people enter the market, that they don't always see themselves as a new member of the hospitality industry.
True. I go and in all honesty, in the past, you could own a vacation home and hire a property manager, and you weren't in the hospitality industry. That property manager was in the hospitality industry. It's only when you remove the property manager and call it superhost, call it whatever you want to, when you're actually managing your own home, your own unit, you are in the hospitality industry, whether you thought you're going to be there or not. And to your point, Madeline, that is not a passive life. That is a very active life of what does it need to look like? How does it need to be cleaned? How does it need to be staged? How do I check people in? How do I check people out? How do I get good reviews? Those are all hurdles that I don't think a lot of people think of when they think, oh, hey, I'll just rent my house on Airbnb or Verbo. I can't even say Verbo. I still want to say VRBO. I think those are the challenges that people have, and they wake up to that probably after their first guest review.
And Derek, how do you see it?
I mean, I I guess agree and disagree to some extent. I think the barriers to entry are lower just because the fact that Airbnb and Vrbo exist. So it's just so it's just easier to I live in Atlanta to be in Atlanta, and I move out of my house and like short-term rent it. In order to be successful, the thing about this industry now is that there are people with varying definitions of what success is, and that's what makes it a little bit more difficult of a market. I.e., there are some people that are like, I'm just gonna throw it up there. If somebody comes, cool, and if I cover my mortgage, then I'm fine. And that is like a lot of the supply that hit the market. They can just withstand lower, like they can have lower quality experience, and they can just have lower profits, and that's okay for them. Or they can have and you have some people that are just hobbyists. They just do it because they just like it, and they don't need to make a lot of money, but they want it's a house next to their house, and they're gonna honestly provide a lot of service, and they're not really in it to make a lot of money. They want to cover some costs, and it's a little bit of a side thing. And there are people like that, and having those type of people in the market. And you have the people who are just like, I'm going to scale, and I'm going to go from having 100 units to 2,500 units in the next year. And you have those people, and they provide a different type of experience, and they have different objectives. And then you have people who are like serious, I am a real estate person, I'm going to run this like a business. Those people are in the long term probably going to be the most likely to sustain themselves and run it as an actual business. But there's a lot of noise in the interim because you have all these people in the market. Because when it comes down to it, the market, the barriers to entry are you need to have another, you need to have a house, and that's the barrier. and not even own it. You just have to like secure it. So
You can arbitrage. And I can back that up with some of our data as well, because we did research on smaller hosts back in 2021 and found that about 30% were really only looking to cover their mortgage and utilities with their goal. And that was the full financial goal. And they were really quite happy to reach that. Of course, some of them may have been doing partial use of the property as well. But then it was around 40% of those hosts who were actually looking to make a profit. And for many of them, the profit wasn't even a full-time income. The profit was extra spending money. The profit was part-time income. My question is, how do you see that affecting overall guest impressions and the attractiveness of the sector moving forward when there is such a mishmash of business goals and profit goals within the sector?
I think that's where branding can make a difference. Like if you can, there are some people who like they have a brand like and they have a guest experience, and that can make a difference. And professionalism can make a difference. Like you being professional, you should look better than someone who's just doing it on the side to cover their mortgage. If you're doing it as a business, you should look better. You should provide it. You should be in the hospitality business, and you should beat those people, or else you're gonna push your margins down.
Well, the industry didn't start that way, Derek, but certainly. When we did a survey in 2000, I guess it was 10. It's been about 14 years ago. We asked people if they had a preference over a professionally managed property or a by owner property, if you will, is what we called them back then. And at the time, people who did express a preference, which was only about 50% of the people cared. But of the people who expressed a preference, the majority preferred owner properties. I don't know how you would get that today. My belief would be that would have switched to professional managers, but I don't know that's actually happened, because the uniqueness in the vacation rental industry used to be the charm of the houses. At this point, professional managers need to have that brand that you were talking about, and they need to stay within a band of economics in order to be really truly successful. You can't have a really crummy house in your portfolio and a luxury house in your portfolio. You can't sustain a brand that way. I think the one thing I would take issue with you, Derek, on is that I don't think that an individual can have a brand. I don't think that the individual's brand is Airbnb or that is Vrbo. It is not their house. They can't afford to have that conceit. Property managers and superhosts can, if they invest in it, and they have to invest in it someplace other than Airbnb or Vrbo to develop that brand.
I mean, I guess you're right. They can't to an extent, but ratings in and of themselves and reviews in and of themselves are a brand that you can cultivate and make sure that you have a bunch of 4.9 star ratings that people are saying things that are awesome about your house. You do that by putting unique things that people are going to comment on. But yeah, you're right. As an individual, it's harder to create that brand. But those people who like say, hey, I'm going to stand out amongst the crowd, they're going to make, they are going to make more money than the people who are like, oh, I'm just throwing something out there. And we're not going to have any silverware or toiletries but it's going to cover my rent. They're going to have their own brand too, and they're going to probably hit their financial goals.
And the irony also is that there have been studies on reviews from properties that are owned by smaller hosts versus properties managed by property managers. The smaller host properties, they tend to have higher reviews, and that's often attributed to more attention for detail, a more personalized experience. Mm-hmm. So while certainly bigger profits might be coming in from the property managers, the guest satisfaction seems to lean towards those smaller rent by owner properties.
Yeah, Madeline, property managers have changed a lot over the last 10 years and 20 years. When the industry really started to get its wings, just for some historical perspective for people who weren't even born then, In 2004, less than 4% of the U.S. traveler market had ever stayed in a what they called back then a villa. And when we went to do research for HomeAway to find out how many houses there were, the best we could find was something that Phocuswright, that's not Phocuswright, Resort Quest had commissioned. And their estimate was, and it's in their S1, that there were 250,000 of these houses in the United States. And we looked at this, Brian Sharples, who co-founded HomeAway, and I looked at this, and we realized that there were 40,000 homes on VRBO alone. So 250,000 was like bullshit, couldn't be real, had to be fake. And we didn't know how big the market was, but we knew it wasn't 250,000 homes. At that point in time, you needed a property manager. So the earth-changing thing that Vrbo and the antecedents of Vrbo and Airbnb did was bring people into the say, you can start.
Anybody can be a host.
Anybody can do it. And that the owners, the first people to bolt were people who hated their property managers. They didn't like those property managers because a property manager, in order to get you 80% occupancy, he needed to get all of his properties to 79. And then he would take you to 80%. And the owners realized they were leaving money on the table and they needed that money to cover the cost. It goes back to what are people trying to do? I think it's still true that most people who have a vacation home, a second home, are only trying to offset the cost of ownership. I think that when you get to a person who's renting his own flat and moving out, that person's definition of profit is, can I cover my mortgage? That ain't profit. Real profit is after you cover all your expenses, and we know what that the group of us here understand what profits are. But it is this definition of where profits are and what do I need to make that has really exploded the number of properties worldwide in this industry. Go ahead.
I'd like to touch on something that you had mentioned in terms of the inventory numbers, because we have grown very significantly from the time when that lowball number was put out of only a potential 250,000 properties in the US that could be rented. But now one of the hot topics is that US markets are saturated with short-term rentals and that the inventory levels are actually outpacing demand. So I wanted to chat about that for a bit. To what extent is that real? And if we hit an oversaturation point, who are the first people who get weeded out, and who continues to have staying power if saturation is something we hit?
Yeah,
Derek,
I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so, when it comes down to it, you have a lot of people who are thinking, do I rent my property out short-term or long-term? There are a lot of small and local, like real estate owners, whether they be professional or this is what they do on the side, and they have to decide, do I rent my house out long-term or short-term? Well, if you can rent it out short-term, you're going to make more money. So there is an arbitrage, not the rental arbitrage, but just like an arbitrage playing the long-term and short-term markets. As long as the size of that arbitrage is bigger than the cost to generate it, which that cost is additional time and effort to manage all the turnover of a short-term rental, and then the cost of putting in furniture and the like, then there's going to be more supply than demand. And eventually there's going to be enough supply that's going to push that spread down to the point where there just is no arbitrage, because that's how arbitrages work. So my thought is, right now there is still a spread between short-term and long-term rentals, even after paying a manager. And so there's going to continue to be more supply than demand. And that's going to hurt the people who underwrote and need this premium. Like some people, they spent a lot of money in these properties. They have a lot of infrastructure, and they need these premiums to persist for their business model.
You mean they need the higher occupancy, or to be able to maintain the higher ADRs in order to break even, or in order to meet their projections?
In order to pay down their debt, in order to pay the staff, in order to pay the investors who they told, hey, yeah, I'm going to go from 15 to 25,000 units in the next 3 years. Like they're those people are going to be squeezed because the arbitrage is just not going to exist because the supply will continue to outpace the demand, and that's what we're seeing. And it's just, if you just look at economics 101, you have a bunch of people in the economics 101 class, and they say, hey, there's arbitrage in the market where you have a short-term rental because the new technology makes it more available in long-term, which reduces the cost of doing short-term rental, right? Because the cost used to be you have to market and find these people. Now you have a Airbnb or Vrbo that they reduce the cost of that marketing. So like because the costs are reduced, there's this arbitrage and it will close. And we're seeing it close, and the evidence of it is the supply.
Sure.
Yeah. And then,
Brandon, are there indicators on the side
Yeah.
of the real estate data when we approach saturation or when we hit that?
yeah, I think Derek, to your point, there is a spread right now. But when you're deciding, am I going short term or long term in regards to my investment property, the other side of the house is if you look at the long term rental space, right? Like residential rentals where people are staying years. At a national level, we're at all-time highs in inventory on the long-term rental side. We're seeing rentals now in the market in numbers that we've never seen historically. We are experiencing a little bit of a downturn, but overall, I mean, inventory is there. So if you do go from the short-term to the long-term market, you're also going to an oversaturated market as well on the long-term side. On the second piece of that spread potentially decreasing, right now we're at an all-time high of rents as well. Like rental prices are at all-time highs, depending on which market you look. I mean, we all know real estate's very hyper local, but the overall macro view of rents is we're at the peak, right? Rents are going to start decreasing over time, just due to that oversaturation in the LTR space, right? The long-term
So-
rentals.
Just clarifying that there is a lot of long-term inventory out there, but when there's all this talk about accessibility of housing, it doesn't necessarily have to do with the number of long-term units available, but the affordability of the ones on the market. Is that what I'm understanding?
Correct. Yeah, rents are super expensive, but they are staying elevated because there is, as of right now, a demand for long-term rentals in the residential real estate space. That's why we're having all-time historic levels of inventory, but prices haven't crashed on the rental side. So we're trying to decide, am I going short-term or long-term? You really have to dive into that specific market you're in, because there's markets out there like Los Angeles where everyone thought rents were going to crash because they experienced that huge growth in rents and home prices, post-pandemic. But now they're seeing price growth again. I mean, just to purchase a home in California right now, Los Angeles is up 20% from last year. Rents are up 15% from last year. So there is some markets where it might be beneficial to go long term because we're seeing this elevated home price and rental price. But then there's some markets in San Antonio, Texas, that rents are going down. So when you're trying to decide, am I going to go short term or long term? The projected rents in San Antonio are decreasing over the next 12, 18 months. So you really have to look at the market your property is in to determine what's a better situation and measure that spread that Derek was talking about between the amount of money that can bring in the short term versus long term.
Yeah, but the other challenge there, Brandon, is you're talking about cities. And in the short-term rental industry, when you get into cities, New York, Paris, San Francisco, the rise in units in the short-term industry came from people who were renting the apartment that they then went ahead and put on Airbnb or VRBO. They didn't own those apartments.
Sure.
When you are talking about rents and how the arbitrage works, it's a different thing to arbitrage something in New York City, which we know
Is
all
not
the
done anymore.
regulations there. Yeah, it's not happening, except it is, and you can still rent out. I could get an apartment this afternoon in New York City. I know how to do it. But the notion here is that cities are dramatically different. And arbitrage is also something that we need to actually start segmenting. There's personal arbitrage, where I'm arbitraging my apartment, my house where I live. And then there's the arbitrage at scale at the far end of the spectrum that I think Derek was sort of talking about as well. When a business goes out, raises money in order to enter into long-term leases and the turnaround and to rent those at scale. Those can happen in cities. It's very difficult to do that in vacation markets. Breckenridge, Colorado is a different market fundamentally than Los Angeles, but they both have one thing in common. Rents for people who want to live full time in Breckenridge are skyrocketing because you make so much more money from short-term rental. I don't know what's driving. You're the expert, Brandon. I don't know what's driving the increase in Los Angeles, but I suspect it's the income, what people make and what they can afford in Los Angeles that lets them rent long term for $8,000 and $9,000 a month an apartment. It's not something that happens in San Antonio, Texas. There is nobody paying $7,000 a month for a house in an apartment or a home in San Antonio. It's just it is hyper local.
I just want to clarify that when I was saying arbitrage, there is a rental arbitrage. I was saying just like because short-term rental income is going to be higher than long-term rental income, they're just going to influence people when they have a property to choose short-term instead of long-term.
Mm-hmm.
So just wanted to clarify that. But also another thing in San Antonio that's different from LA and why you might see weakness in San Antonio and not LA is because when it comes down to it, just today, like right now, there's a lot of supply of long-term rentals, i.e. apartments that were built and delivered in San Antonio, when LA, there's not that supply of a whole bunch of apartments hitting the market because it's just harder to build. And because when interest rates were lower, people built a lot of housing because there's a lot of demand there, and now it's all hitting the market all at the same time, which I think is probably short-term because people were building because there is demand. Eventually, those units are going to get absorbed. They're not building now. So you're going to have, 2 years from now, all the apartments that would have been built, but couldn't be built because we have this kind of funding recession, as in it's harder to get funding to build. Like rents are going to go back up. But, at least that's my, I don't know, that's my economics theory thing, but,
When I talk about I should probably clarify that. When I talk about the numbers that I run on my side, this is strictly like single family. So this is no apartments. This is just single family condos and townhomes. But I think, Carl, what you brought back, you mentioned something earlier about like, if I want to enter the market, I can either like use my grandma's house. I can use an ADU. I can go acquire a house, or like you mentioned, I can rent a house and then try to cover that rent through short-term rentals. But what we're seeing right now is in some of these markets that are, I guess, trendy for short-term rentals, as those rents are increasing. I think I ran numbers this morning. LA was something ridiculous. Like the median price was like $5,000 a month, I think, was the number this month. So in order to have a successful, depending on what you define as profits, like we all talked about here, to have a successful, I'm gonna go get a rental and then use it for short term, that profit margin is greatly impacted by what's happening on the SFR space for the long-term space, right? $5,000 a month could be a lot more difficult to acquire or to cover in the short-term space as supply does increase in these markets.
I want to return to margins in a moment because I think that's a tremendously important conversation for the current market. But first, I wanted to quickly bounce back to something that Carl had said before, which is that one of his green flags for somebody who would succeed in the short-term rental industry is someone who takes themselves seriously as a hospitality professional. When you hit a point of saturation, it can be indiscriminate in how it weeds people out of the market. Of course, talented people can stay, but sometimes there are people who are doing the right thing who are weeded out of the market as well. Do you foresee a significant advantage, Carl, for the people who were serious hospitality professionals, or do you think saturation is going to come for everyone alike?
I think I think that saturation is something we're going to deal with in 2024. And I mean, if you just look at what happened, in my view, what happened was you hit the pandemic, people could live any and work anywhere. People began to see what was happening, and that people were taking long term. They were renting short term, but they were staying long term. They were renting 30 days as opposed to a weekend, and they were taking their kids and going someplace and working there because they were all working from home. As we move back to a more normal world, that's that sort of guest is declining. There, you still have, and I see them in all the aspects of travel. Especially in my hostel world life, I see the digital nomads that are out there. It's a small group. Yeah, I mean, my friend Brian Chesky loves to talk about digital nomads, but there are like 9 of them, really. It's not a huge group of people. It's, the single guy who can just travel and work anywhere went away. But during the pandemic, he could take his kids with him. Now you've got all the people who entered the market for that. And I don't care how they entered it. Did they buy a house? Did they rent something that they thought they could arbitrage? Did they move out of their home to a trailer so that they could rent their main house, which is still the predominant thing that happens in Tuscany? I don't know if people realize that, but if you want to rent a house in Tuscany, most of the time, those are the houses that the people who own them move out to the guest quarters for the season, right? And that's been going on since the 1800s. That's how that arbitrage seems to work. But I think that when you are dealing with trying to get people to stay in your house, you have 2 things that are happening. It's your rate. Are you competitive on rates, and are you competitive on value? And value is the thing that is hard to get over in an Airbnb or Vrbo listing, is what that value is. And that's something that hospitality people who are focused on hospitality tend to do better in attracting guests. They are deeply affected, though, Madeline, by the supply. The rent, the average daily revenue in Austin has stayed the same or declined since 2019. That is because there's just so much more inventory here in Austin than there was in 2019. So in 2019, you still had the limited number of people who had stayed this way. Now you've got a big spike in the people who have stayed in vacation homes or rentals. That's coming down at the same time that because people are going back to hotels, they're going back to resorts, they're going to Europe, for God's sake. So there are things that are taking people out of their travel bubble they were in during the pandemic. Rates are falling. Those rates are going to take some of the arbitrageurs out. If you bought a house in 2022 or 2020, let's go back to 2020, when rates were 3%, and you have this is something for Brandon, and you have a long-term or an ARM or something that's going to adjust up in 5 years to the normal interest rate that we are charging right now. Can you even stay in this business? And what are you going to have to do to try to get your rates to match your cost?
That's a big branding question for sure, because God forbid someone did purchase at a variable interest rate. What are they looking at moving forward in terms of how it's going to affect margins in coming years?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I will never to this day try to predict an interest rate. I've learned that the hard way. Every time you think you know where the interest rates are going, something happens. But I think we're all, as an industry in the real estate, we're all under the agreement that we're probably at the peak or close to the peak of mortgage rates or interest rates for this cycle. There are some ranges that say that there is some things that can play out that can push it up to an 8%. But for the most part, I think everyone's in agreement that we're kind of at the peak of the cycle. From the Fed standpoint, they are slowly giving signals that there might be a cut or two coming soon. But as the mortgage rates do decrease, that's also gonna just add more competition and inventory in the rental side, right? So if you are in the long-term space, right? I'm very specific to long-term. We don't really track short-term rental data on our side. But as those rentals come, the mortgage prices come down, we are going to see kind of a shift from more renters to home buyers because homes do become more affordable. So the inventory is going to increase on the long-term rental space, which we know as supply increases, that can put more downward pressure on rentals, rent prices. So that's why we're saying long-term rent prices are expected to continue to go downward, especially if mortgage rates do come down. So it's always back to that conversation that y'all were having, like long-term rental versus short-term rental. Long-term rental prices will come down in the next few, call it 18 months.
So if the market does become more attractive again for people who still want to be new entrants in that space, I do want to chat about what's happening with some of the newcomers or even people who are expanding portfolios and are having to learn how to operate this at scale. Because due to the fact that there are limited barriers to entry, kind of limited requirements to go into this space, you don't necessarily have an industry where people have been working in short-term rentals for an extended period in order to get the training to understand what kind of money they can make, what the revenue projections are going to be, what that's going to look like. Derek, I want to start this with you to talk about this, but what is the information out there like now? There's so much chatter. There's a whole YouTube world telling people how much money they can make. There are certain products out there for projections. There are realtors talking in people's ears about how much money they can make. What's the quality of the information that's out there? And is it improving over time? Do you think it's going to get better, or are the water's still going to stay murky?
There's a lot more data now than there's ever been, and the future is not the same as the past, and the present isn't the same as the past. So that doesn't mean just because there's more data out there doesn't mean that people are going to be better at predicting what their actual profits end up being. And so from my experience, so we lend money to people who own real estate, a lot, mostly commercial real estate, a lot of short-term rental also. So we get to see what the actual margins end up being. And in our experience, projections in reality they're not the same. Like they're like distant cousins, but like they're related, but they're distant cousins. Let's just put it that way. In the best way for someone to predict, the best data out there is people's own experience actually doing stuff in the market, like period. So, but there's
as opposed to neighborhood comps, you're saying.
Oh no, neighborhoods comps are fine. So you have lots of I don't know if I should shout, but there's AirDNA, and there's Rabu, and there's all these places where you can get there's House Canary in there for there's lots of places where you can get data for top line revenue, and the details of what you do on your property are going to be different from the average of the market. So you might be able to beat that, or you might not be able to beat that based off of what you actually do. There is not very much easily accessible data on expenses. And what is going on the expense side of the business is just as important for a lot of people as what's going on the income side of the business, especially newer operators. A lot of the older operators, they have an idea and their expenses are sane. A lot of newer operators, like when I see projections, I just look at them as like, and I say, hey, these expenses seem kind of light, and they're arguing me down. And I'm like, well, all right, like go for it. And then come back to me a year later, and then we'll talk about funding. And sometimes they have come back to me a year later. And I'm not going to say who was right and who was wrong. I'm just going to say that
we'll leave it implied.
Our experience is that reality and projections are just distant cousins, is all I got to say. And expenses are going higher. So even with the data, insurance is going higher, taxes are going higher. So a lot of things there is inflation in the market, and that inflation hits the expense side of the business. So I'd say, yes, there's a lot of data out there. And I think that a lot of times data tricks people, even though it's better data than before, because at least before, when there wasn't as much data, people were more conservative in their assumptions. Now there's a lot of data out there which gives people false senses of security. That's been my experience. um, uh,
I think this, Derek, this is where the intent of the operator becomes very critical. Because if let's take hotels for a second. You don't get a hotel without building it, without you getting all the permits, owning there's a guy or a company that owns that hotel. So therefore, all hotels have data about nightly pricing, which is grounded in the reality of the capital required to actually operate a hotel, to own and operate a hotel. When you take the short-term rental industry, which has everything from people with no capital at all at risk, like none, to people who have $5 and $10 million homes in Lake Como, where they have huge amount of capital at risk, then you have that as one layer. As the second layer, you say, what are people trying to make, right? And for the vast majority of vacation home owners, and I'm not going to talk about cities, that's Brandon's world, but for vacation home marketplaces, one of the things that goes into the equation of that owner is the long-term appreciation of the property. So therefore, if you're covering your cost, if you're covering your mortgage, I mean, I do this. I have a place in Tiburon, California. So far I've owned that house. I don't rent it short term because it's against the law, but just the price of appreciation in the appreciation, the value of that unit in Tiburon, California, that we've now owned for 10 years, has covered every trip I've ever made to California, airfare, food while I'm there. It's that, to me, it's been a huge profit because I get to see my kids when I'm in California and live in my own house. That's my definition of a profit, is long-term when I own the property, which is the same as the hotel person. If you're looking at rates and if you go out on Airbnb or HomeAway Vrbo, and you start looking at rates, those are just the published rates, right? And you don't know what the actual rate was. And if you run your back of the envelope spreadsheet on an Excel spreadsheet with those rates, you're going to be screwed, because those rates are not the rates that people are actually getting. The rates that people are getting are often changed by exchange back and forth. I never pay the rate. You always contact the host. You always tell them you stay for 3 days if they price 2 days for 3. You always do that stuff, and you always get lower rates that way. But that's because I've been traveling this way since 1985. The point is that those published rates that are on AirDNA and all that stuff, it's not grounded like hotel rates are grounded, because everybody's on the same playing field in a hotel. When you take out that everybody is not on the same playing field from capital investment in the short-term rental space, those rates are all over the place. And one guy's $100 that makes him $195 in profit is another guy's $100 that loses him $200 a night. So you just don't know what's happening with those rates and whether or not you should be banking on them.
And then even two people in the same neighborhood with a similar property, one person, is putting his heart and soul, or her heart and soul, into this property. And they come and you enter, and it's like, confetti falling from the ceiling. And there's a note saying, "We love you. I hope you enjoy your stay." And the other person is like, there might be soap in the bathroom and no toilet paper. Like
I have stayed in both.
Yeah. So it's just hard to, is there more data? There's more data. Is that, but it's still the wild, wild west out there.
Yeah. I think to build on what Derek's saying, if you're entering this space, if you're listening to the show today and you're going to try to enter this space, you're going to have to do your own research on what your rates are going to be. And then you're going to have to say, is that realistic from the standpoint of what I would need to do in order to cover the cost of what I'm about to enter? And that is something that's deeply personal. It's going to depend on how much you're having to, it's your expenses. Derek is absolutely right. People do not look on the expense side of this business nearly enough. And one of those expenses is not just your mortgage rate, it's the capital cost that you're giving by putting a down payment on a house of $150,000, $200,000. That's also in your cost of long-term return. All of that's in there, right?
And repairs. I feel like people just assume that repairs are not going to happen.
Yeah.
But people coming in and out of your house every week, they're going to mess some stuff up. They have kids, and kids definitely are going to mess stuff up.
Right.
And dogs are like,
Although I will say, being both the long-term and short-term rental, I have far less damage. I mean, and this data goes all the way back to HomeAway. It was so much less wear and tear to rent short term on a house for me than long term. And long term renters destroy your house. I once rented to my own banker, my company's banker. I rented a house to her, and she friggin' destroyed it. I could not believe that anybody was that messy as a human being.
Only had to turn it one time for her in like a couple years, as opposed to they're less wear and tear, but you turn it 3 times a week.
Right. But I ended up paying Derek about $10,000 to repair her damages. But on short-term rentals, I know the minute that person moves out of that, I can assess about what they've done to the house. I can charge them for it, and I can move on. So our houses are I think much better maintained. But to your point, it is still the cost of ownership that I think, if anyone's listening to this today, do not underestimate the cost of owning or when you rent and buy the furniture that goes into. You're going to own that furniture even if you've arbitraged the apartment, right? That's all hard costs that you need to put down in an Excel spreadsheet. And to Derek's point, do not be rosy-eyed on this. Shit happens. And you need to take care of your house, or you're not going to be able to rent it.
So we would really be remiss to not go into that deeper discussion about budgeting. This is something I nerd out on. And it's something that I've also had to think about as a consumer. I posted on LinkedIn about this event that one of the things that inspired it was a short-term rental stay where the cleaners needed extra support during the turnover after my party left. And then the host tried to charge through the resolution center for the cost of filling up their car with gas to drive from their primary property to the investment property to go support the cleaners. Now, I know that's not necessarily widespread, but it does make the case in point that there are people out there who don't necessarily understand what the expected costs are of doing business and how to budget for everything. So I wanted to first put out there, how sophisticated are the budgets that hosts are creating? What are the major factors that they need to take into account? And if a budget isn't appropriately sophisticated, to what extent does it affect the viability of the business and the rental property's ability to stay on the market?
I personally don't think budgets need to be sophisticated. I just think that they need to have contingency, and it needs to be generous. Like, it doesn't need to be, don't make it more complicated. Just because it's more precise doesn't make it more accurate. It's just, I think it needs humility. Budget needs more humility than line items. Humility in that might be wrong and expenses might go up, but so don't overcomplicate it is what I'd say. Just have a contingency.
Well, I think I'd be interested in Brandon's view on this as well, from because his long-term rental costs are the same. Some of the costs of maintaining a long-term rental is the same as a short-term. But to what Derek is saying there, I'd add that you really do have to look at this as you are in the hospitality business. This is no longer that you're just running your house for you. So therefore, you do have to have it deeply cleaned. If you don't have a deep cleaned house after every stay, you're in trouble long term. But your reviews are going to reflect that, and you're going to be penalized. So
maintenance contingencies, inventory turnover,
and you have to be fast. I mean, I had a guy move out of my short-term rental and I went down there and I said, how did you tear off a cabinet door? How did you take, how did you ruin the button that you push to turn on the garbage disposal? How did you push that sucker all the way through the granite countertop? How did that happen? But we had other guests coming in the next day. So we had to get a plumber out there short term. We had to get a cabinet maker back out there to put the door back on. And that stuff you have to do immediately in between turns, because if you can't really tell somebody, or about 2 weeks ago, some 250-pound guy got into the upper bunk of a kid's bed, and surprise, he collapsed the bed. He was all pissed off because he got the bed collapsed. And I said, well, what idiot as a 250-pound, 6'4" man gets into the upper bunk of a twin bed? I mean, how stupid can you be? But still, I had to fix it before the people could come back, right? Those are the costs that Derek is talking about, that you can't budget down to the detail and say, oh, I'm going to have to budget that I have to fix a bed every fourth time. Bullshit. You just have to have money that in your contingency to maintain the house, to keep the house clean, to actually get decent sheets and decent towels and stuff like that people note in their reviews. If you don't note it, if you don't get a good review in this business, you're in really deep trouble. But Brandon, to bring you into it, what are the cost of ownership that people should be looking at besides just that mortgage?
Yeah, I mean, mortgage is obviously the biggest overhead there, right? If you're going to acquire a short-term rental and actually go out and search for a home. But I think, Carl, you talked about like your investment property, right? Your short-term rental or your long-term rental. You even think about in terms of longevity, like I'm going to be here for a while. I'm going to own this for a long time. So you think about home appreciation. I think that's key here, because I mean, hearing Carl and Derek talk about all the expenses is already stressing me out. I don't even have a short-term rental. I just have my house. So hearing these stories of
It's
like,
a
hey,
stressful business, Brandon.
it's definitely not passive income. I've learned that. And I've also learned I need to talk to hosts more so I can stop paying the rate that they show. But to Carl's point, it is expensive. So I think a lot of homeowners or potential people entering this investment, if you're looking to earn a profit or cover your mortgage, you need to look at the home expense side or the home appreciation side as well. In Carl's example, he got lucky where his home had an enormous price growth over the time he purchased it to where he is at now. So that equity can cover some of this cost and help reduce some of the cost of maintaining a short-term rental. But there's some markets that if you're buying at the wrong time, you're buying now, or you bought in 2022 when home prices were at all-time highs, you're not seeing this home appreciation. So when you think of costs of like maintaining a property over time plus home appreciation, or in some cases we're seeing depreciation, like prices going down, you're losing equity. So now you got to ask yourself, is my expenses over time in the short-term rental space to maintain this property, is it actually going to exceed what the equity I'm gaining minus my overhead costs, et cetera? So everyone always assumes home prices do, increase 3% per year, but we know over the last 4 years that's not true. So I think adding home appreciation into your calculations of is it worth going into this investment will help you be a little bit more calculated in your decision.
Derek, I know that you have some views into this, but on top of those expected budgets and expected maintenance costs, to what extent are people actually reinvesting profits back into their properties and reinvesting into the businesses?
Yeah, so we are mostly working with people who are professional real estate investors. And so most of the time they're investing significant amounts back into the business by buying other properties, and doing what Carl was saying in terms of like, as something messes up, immediately getting back in there, and someone messed up the rug where you're putting in a new, better rug. It needed to go anyway, type thing. So people are investing a lot, and those are the people who are going to just like, they might underperform in the short term in terms of just like they're not squeezing every dollar out, but they're overperforming in the long run because they just have better product, and they have better property when it goes to rent and goes to get those reviews, and when it goes to sell, like you're going to go be in the for sale market is going to perform better. So yeah, the people that are doing well are reinvesting, and the people who are not reinvesting, you're
Are
playing
not
this.
doing well.
Some of them are honestly sure, but it's a short-term versus long-term thing. So
Madeline, I have a question for Brandon. That if it's okay, I'm wondering, given what's happened from 2020 during the pandemic and 3% interest rates to today 7% plus, the fact that some people who bought houses and bought properties may not be able to sustain them even with their 3% mortgages. To what extent does the real estate industry think that some of these houses are going to be foreclosed on? People who can't rent their houses short term, can't cover their costs of ownership long term. Does the real estate industry think those homes are coming back into the market, either by hook or by crook? Are we looking at a potential increase in for sale inventory by people who are saying, I've got to get out of this? Is there any data that you have about that?
Yeah, definitely. So, in terms of like potential supply entering the market, the only real supply that we're really seeing increase is or could increase the market is new construction. New construction, we're seeing more volume. Obviously, they the more they build, the less their product is worth. So they're smart when it comes to supply and demand. They're not going to oversaturate. But there's this big idea that, people can't afford their homes, and we're going to see an increase in defaults and foreclosures. We track that data every monthly, and there's no increase in those sort of factors of notice of defaults or foreclosures. And the reason is most of these people who have a 3% mortgage rate, they're locked in for 30 years. During these 30 years, we've seen, even over the last 4 years, we've seen income levels rise, right? That they're getting paid more through inflation. So their home costs are staying constant. Their 3% mortgage, it's not an adjustable mortgage rate. They're locked in 3%. So they're actually not leaving because they don't want to enter the market with a 7% interest rate. And then the other thing is no one ever sells their home to be homeless. So every seller that enters the market's more than likely also a buyer. Now, of course, there's edge cases there. You might have multiple properties, but most home sellers are also home buyers. So it's a complete wash in that supply and demand dynamic on the purchase side of the market. The only way we're going to see inventory really increase significantly, where it can actually impact prices, is the construction side. But then on the build to rent, which is a really hot market right now in residential real estate, is you build 30, 40 homes at a time, all for rentals, which is why we're seeing this big influx of rentals entering the markets, that build to rent market. So I don't see inventory for purchases really skyrocketing and causing home prices to crash. But the home prices for rentals in the long term are definitely at its peak.
So for the short-term rental market, that would also mean that exits from the market, if someone is pushed out, would look more like a sale, because you've said that long-term is already crowded. Foreclosure is not what's tracking in the data. So it really goes back on the selling market if an exit does take place.
Yeah, if you're looking to exit the short-term rental in today's, well, once again, I'm talking macro level, right? There's very specific markets where you can still go both directions, but at a macro level, home prices are still at the highest they've ever been. We're almost back to the 2022 numbers, where rents are not, right? Rents are coming down. So if you're exiting and you don't want to be in the hospitality, or you don't want the quote unquote passive income that y'all talked about today, there's a lot of markets in the United States where it might be a better option to dispose of that property, sell it, and really get that money back in the equity of the home.
We have 2 minutes left. I wanted to go around and get a quick take of what is one prediction each of you have for what inventory is going to look like 5 years from now.
Over 5 years, that inventory will increase because the demand for the category, this is a category, Madeline, that still meets a lot of hot buttons for travelers. It's the lowest cost per night. It's a great place for families and friends to gather. It's the demand. Now that we've taught people about the demand, it'll stay growing. Yeah, I think you have some downturns in 2024 mainly and 2023 mainly because people started traveling again outside their countries. But give it to 2025 and in a 5-year horizon, inventory will continue to grow.
Derek?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like inventory will be higher. I guess if there are any, and I don't know, I don't think that's a bold prediction. If anything, I'd say the difference between short-term rental, what you can make renting short-term versus what you can make renting long-term, that spread I think will decrease. So I think that it will be harder to generate excess returns in short-term rentals 5 years from now than it is today.
And Brandon?
Yeah, I'm not going to give my prediction for short term. It's out of my expertise. But for long term rentals, especially if mortgage rates do get cut a few times, we're going to see inventory continue to rise in the long term space over the next year. 5 years, who knows? No one predicted 2019. I hate predicting 5 years, but definitely in the next 1 year to 18 months, rental inventory across the country will continue to rise in a majority of the markets.
Sure. I wanted to thank everyone so much for coming, so much for sharing the expertise. If anyone has more interest in learning about Phocuswright research on this, we'll be kicking off a project in Q3 and there will be opportunity to get more data. Thanks everyone so much for sharing their expertise and sharing so much information today. We really loved hearing from you.